Okay. Well, welcome to our folks online, but also welcome to our folks who are here in Ducey Conference Room with us. Very grateful to have all of you here. We have passed 9 o'clock now, and so we'll go ahead and get started because as I learned this week preparing for this, we have a lot of stuff to cover. And this is not meant to be, this is a series called Listening for God, and the venue or the avenue that we're searching him in are in short stories or essays. So it's not meant to be a biography. I simply wanted to show you a listing of the books by Andy Dillard. The description next to it about what it is, and then also any sentence underneath, is written by Andy Dillard herself. And so as you see, her first publication, 1974, poems, nonfiction narrative, unlicensed literary theory, jolly journalism, which I thought was one of my favorites. And this was a group of American writers who visited China, writing about very serious things. And then the return trip, the Chinese journalists came to the US, but they took them to Disneyland. And so therefore, she just thought it was the funniest thing she'd ever seen. So, she calls it jolly journalism. A memoir, nonfiction. Finally, you get to a novel. The Living is a novel. And then Mornings Like This was intriguing to me. She would take phrases from old books and then arrange those phrases into poems. So, just a phrase from this page, a phrase from that page, and somehow put it together and make a poem, many of them ironic. And I loved what she said about this. She said that a well-done job is one that is difficult, but you make it look easy. A bad job is one that looks easy, but is actually difficult to do. And that's what this task was for her, that it was very difficult to arrange these phrases into poems. So over a span of 25 years, she wrote 10 books, so about a book every 2.5 years, and then a long 8-year layoff until The Maytrees came out, which was her last novel. These I have at the end, they actually are written, they actually fall in between the other ones, but these are collected things. So these are actually previously published pieces that were then regathered and published. She's more of an editor for these instead of the original author, although she was the author of some of the essays. So these are collections. And then I just simply have the sources there about where I get this information from. Her writing is very, very personal. And I wanted to refer you to Wholly the Firm. She said it was just an idea that occurred to her. She lived in Washington, and there are many islands off the coast of different cities there, Seattle, Bellingham, other things. And so she simply decided one time to write about a nonfiction account of 3 consecutive days on this island off of Bellingham. She had no preconceived notions, just whatever happened is what she was going to include in the book. And on the second day, a plane crashed on the island. And it was a terrible crash. And a little girl in her story was quite seriously hurt. And interestingly enough, for those of you who have been coming to the Sunday Faith Forum, if you want to go back about 4 or 5 weeks, the name she gave the girl in the story was Julie Norwich. And so there's a little bit of a connection there. But the quote that Annie herself said about Wholly the Firm, this was the problem of pain. Why would an omnipotent, omniscient, and merciful God allow natural evil to happen? And so that I wanted to give that little introduction as we then look at our first short story or essay for today, The Deer at Providencia. And with first, the question I'm throwing out is, what is it that you think of when you think of Providence? This is in South America, and so it's the Spanish name, but what is it you think of when you think of Providence?
So, Michael, I immediately saw Providencia is Spanish for Providence.
Mm-hmm.
So, Merriam-Webster is divine guidance or care. God perceived as the power sustaining and guiding human destiny. But that's the first definition, the parts A and B. But also The quality of being provident, which is another word for frugal.
Okay.
So this word is packed with meaning. And this woman is a writer. I'm sure she was very aware that there was dual meanings to this word. As far as frugality, if the dogs caught this deer, and this is in a small village, they're going to eat it. They're not going to let it go to waste. They're not going to say, "Oh, yippee," and let it go.
I will admit that I put this image up here more because I like the image, but providence of God, his constant care for and absolute rule over all creation. So more the first definition that you were telling us about, for his own glory and the good of his people. So interestingly enough, that their stay in Ecuador was in a place called Providencia. If you've had a chance to read the short story, it's about 4 Americans who travel, this woman and then 3 men. The men are older. They're a little bit more continental. She refers to them as being from big cities, and she's not from a big city. But they go on this journey, and as part of it, they come to this town, and just as you said, Barbara, the dogs have trapped this deer, and quite a lengthy description of not just the village itself, and I'm calling your attention here to the very last line at the bottom. At the village called Providencia, we saw a sight that moved us all but shocked the men. I thought that was an interesting introduction, maybe a little foreshadowing. So then there was this long description of the deer itself, and it's quite horrible and violent, because this deer is tied up, and in trying to escape has trapped its own hooves between his neck and the rope. He's trying to loosen the rope to get away, and instead he's catching his hooves there and scratching. He's bleeding, clearly struggling, obviously I'm thinking scared, and so there's quite this description of it, but the description to me when I read it seems rather distant, not as somebody who was greatly affected by this horrible thing that's going on, but just somebody who was reporting it. Did you have any thoughts when you were reading through this part of it about what either she was experiencing or she was reporting?
It seemed a little dispassionate to me, the description. And then she goes on to talk about what a delicious and wonderful lunch they had. After seeing this animal suffering.
Little disconnect.
So, I'm thinking about this character that she's portraying. Which you haven't gotten this far yet, but I'll wait.
Okay. And good morning, Catherine. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
So as Barbara just said, they go from this scene where these horrible things are happening to this deer who is in the throes of death. That's going to be the outcome of this. There is no other alternate. And then she goes on to discuss the lunch they had, lovely fish. And the description she made of that, with our fingers, we pulled soft fragments of it from its sides to our plates and ate. It was delicate fish flesh, fresh and mild. Someone found the roe. I ate that too. It was fat and stronger like egg yolk, naturally enough and warm. And so really, as the most gentle food critic, describing the lunch that was served them in this village. But then she also talks about there's a stew of meat. And when she had asked about the deer that was captured, she had been told in Spanish that it was gama. And then as they were now eating this meat that was in the stew, they were told it was gama. and she thinks it just is a word that means game. But, quite likely this was deer, the deer that had been caught yesterday, was probably what they were having for lunch. And so this description of what they were eating, and this just to me sounded like a very civilized luncheon party, on the veranda. And Barbara, you've already brought up, seemed to contrast with what they had been observing prior to that.
So what she experienced for herself, she was very engaged with that and very sensitive to that. And she enjoyed it very much. And yes, there's a disconnect. Go on.
And let me bring up that word providence again. Any thoughts about providence now that we see what's unfolding in this story, first with the scene they come upon, and then with the lunch that they sit down and enjoy?
I'm reminded of some phrases of Ignatius of Loyola in the spiritual exercises, where he wants people to pay attention to how many have suffered so that we might live. So there's some sense in which all of creation suffers that we might survive. So that has to do with what we eat, but also in relationships, people suffer our personalities, our brokenness, and so on. So it just made me think of Ignatius.
As it appears that the story might be coming to the end, we now kind of find out why it is the men were shocked. The men weren't shocked by the deer and what was happening to it. They were shocked that she wasn't reacting to it. I have not included this clip in the notes, but it talks about how one of them said that, if this were my wife here, she would not be accepting this. She would be intervening to do whatever she could to alleviate the suffering of that deer. And so it seems like what the men were shocked by was her demeanor, by her reaction to the situation. A bit ironic that they were shocked by her non-reaction, but weren't really reflecting on their own non-reaction. I wonder sometimes, do we find fault in others for not displaying the character traits that we may ourselves not display very well? But in her, as I said, it almost seemed like the story was coming to an end. She just says, well, I've traveled, I eat meat. These things are not issues, they are mysteries. And so what surprises you, that there is suffering here, or that I know it? What is it that surprises you? Which I thought was an interesting question. Which one surprises them? So because the story has seemingly come to an end, I thought of a couple of passages, and I just wanted to bring them up. In the various covenants God made with his people, especially in the Old Testament, there are promises made about, if you will rely on me, if you will put your faith in me. And so here there are assurances that, that I will care for you, I'll provide for you. And I think it's, again, perhaps we'll see in a moment what it means about when you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. That's going to come up in just a second. But Linda, regarding what you were saying just a moment ago about, we each suffer so that others can live, or our living is as a result of some of the suffering of others. So now we get to the New Testament exhortation that maybe we're asked to try to help each other out with this. And perhaps that's a way forward. As it turns out, that was not the end of the story, because we really completely go off in a different direction. She's back home now, and she tells us about this article that she has taped to her mirror, and she reads every single morning. And it's about a man who has suffered horrible, horrible burning, and incredibly tragically, not for the first time in his life. That much earlier he had gasoline explode, and went through multiple surgeries to reconstruct his face and do other things, only now years later to have gunpowder go off and once again just burn him horribly. And towards the end there, it says, the caption reads, Alan McDonald in Miami hospital bed. All you can see in the photograph is a smudged triangle of a face from his eyelids to his lower lip. The rest is bandages. You cannot see the expression in his eyes. The bandages shade them. So clearly, a man who's going through a tremendous amount. And in the story, when you read it, it even said at one point that when he realized, at the moment when he started to hear the same sounds he'd heard before and knew what was happening to him, he actually said, if my friend hadn't been there, I would have gladly thrown myself into the canal with a rock tied around me. And so the only reason he didn't is because someone was there to help him out a little bit. But this is on her mirror at home, and she reads it every day. Any thoughts about that?
Yes, I had some strong thoughts when I read that, and she goes on to say, please explain to Alan McDonald in his dignity, to the dear at Providencia in his dignity. You read something like that day after day, you become callous to it. It loses its impact of sorrow and empathy.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes like reciting the ABCs.
Mm-hmm.
She has made herself callous,
Mm-hmm.
is what I see in this story.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's painful.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's sad for the character.
Mm-hmm.
I think she's missing something in life, because life isn't always about enjoyment, and to experience life deeply and thoroughly and be really engaged is to experience sorrow and empathy and sympathy and recognize pain,
Mm-hmm.
and want to reach out to alleviate or at least comfort.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't have all that along with your happy days, you're missing out on your full humanity. So I want to, if she were a real person, I would want to shake her. What is wrong with you? Open your eyes, open your heart. That was my reaction.
I'm wondering if it's not perhaps, well, another way to look at it would be that her decision to constantly remind herself of the suffering of others is really an act of extraordinary courage. Most people put daily affirmations of one sort or another on their refrigerators or their mirrors, where what's reflected back to you is what a beautiful world or what a beautiful person you are, or, go for your dreams or whatever. I think that it's courageous to accept suffering in the world as something she's willing to look at. It's certainly, for me, suffering comes in others unexpected, unwanted. There's a lot of angst over it. And she's chosen to look at someone who's suffering. That's my take. It's totally different, Barbara. Maybe it's because I have a daughter that I can't go and visit who's ill right now. And I'm reminded of her suffering, but the suffering of others who are sitting in waiting rooms along with her. So it could be just because that's my frame of reference right now.
You're different, Jay. I see what you're saying, but I see this character as taking suffering as a dry fact.
Mm-hmm. I understand.
Mm-hmm. Well, I maybe have a little different view than either one of you.
Good.
and I think what Annie Dillard, I think what she's saying is, for whatever reason, and it's a mystery. I mean, that's one of the words that she used, is that this is the world that we actually live in. And there is a lot of this. And you know, she reacts to the people from the city because they're not used to seeing this. I mean, this is how all our food, you know, actually so much of our food actually gets produced. And if you want to, you know, have the suffering of the deer in Providencia, I mean, I guess you could go to the feedlots in Omaha or something and say, oh my God, what, you know, this is how I actually eat. But suffering is just a fact of life. It can be very random, like to Alan McDonald in the man in the hospital bed. And I don't understand why that has to be. And I'm grateful that I haven't had to put up with it anymore in my personal life than I have. But you know, but this is the world that we live in. And one thing that we need to do is to be able to tell the truth about where we are. Because if you don't do that, then you know, then you just fall into, I would say, sentimentality. Although that's not a bad thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I don't know. That's kind of where I was heading off on
Joe,
this.
would you say we can be objective and realistic and still have compassion?
Oh yeah,
yeah.
You know, the compassion part is very important. I mean, but it helps to be objective and realistic as well. And so I don't know. Anyway.
And Barbara, I actually think I would agree completely with you if this were truly the very last words of this story. You know, I think I would not think well of this woman. But you start thinking about things, what if this were written by someone who is a doctor or a nurse or other medical professional who worked in a burn unit, and they were simply reminding themselves every day of the importance of their work, you know, of what they were able to accomplish.
Very different.
Doesn't that change the point of view?
Very different.
And that's why, to me, the passage you actually already referred to changed my point of view about that. If that had been the last paragraph, I think I would have come to the same conclusion you did. But it did say, we know, will someone please explain to Alan McDonald and his dignity, to the deer at Providencia and his dignity, what is going on, and copy me on it. And so she's clearly still searching. You know, this is not a conclusion that she has come to. She's searching. Why do things like this happen? Where is it that Providence steps in? And I may be, you know, we all have our own frame of reference for things. It may be because the last presentation, the most recent one I've done, was on John Calvin. But there's a difference between providence and predestination.
Okay.
But where does providence enter into this story? You know, where does it, other than the title, you know, where does it enter in? And good morning, Owen, and welcome.
Good morning. I'm enjoying listening to you all.
So Michael, you mentioned the perennial question, why do these happen? Personally, I quit asking it. It just
Michael,
Yes, Nina.
the paragraph above it, as a nurse, and I'm sure Linda understands this also, a burn patient is probably one of the worst you'll ever have.
Mhm.
In the last sentence there says you cannot see his eyes. You cannot see the expression in his eyes. To me, that means this is the absolute worst thing that could happen to a person, and we do not look at them and get and see how bad the situation is because we don't see their eyes. This is pretty serious when you have that kind of health problem, which I hate to say health problem because it's more a life or death situation.
And I agree with you, Nina, about how especially terrible this is with burn patients, because the very touching you do in the healing of them also brings them great pain. And so it's just terrible.
Just when I was reading it, just the smell of the burn, it came back to me.
Mm-hmm. Now we've just looked at this story, the Deer of Providencia, where there seemed to be one story that was told and came to a conclusion, and then a second story seemingly unrelated to the first. But then that question at the end about, can you explain to either Alan MacDonald and the dignity of his suffering, to the deer and the dignity of his suffering, what is going on? And this format is apparently employed by Annie Dillard, because in the next one we're going to look at, we have the same thing that happens.
Can I just mention one other thing?
Mm-hmm.
And you didn't focus on this, but there was one sentence where Annie is, or she's talking about the wonderful food that they ate, and she learned that because that increases the lactic acid, which tenderizes and makes
Yes.
the food that much better to eat.
Yes.
And so, one of the things is presumably the villagers knew this,
Mm-hmm.
and explained that to her,
Mm-hmm.
and encouraged the suffering because it made the food better.
And I don't know if I would go with encourage. I think I might go with simply allowed or tolerated.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because that is not a passage that I included in the notes for you to read, but that was in there, that the very struggling that the deer goes through actually makes the meat more tender when it's consumed.
It goes back to this is a pretty objective description of what's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
So does the suffering of others then tenderize us?
I hope so.
Does it make us more empathetic? There are ways of tenderizing and ways of tenderizing. And so
No,
I'm not sure you can understand people suffering, all of it. So it may not make you empathetic towards the person if you don't really understand how deep the hurt is. Mainly because they hide it.
as we transition now to look at our other reading for today, A Field of Silence, I included this passage, which is from very early in the essay, for a number of reasons. One is it simply established that the place has existed. This farm has been here forever. It may not have been a farm, it may not have been lived on by the current family, but it's a farm that's been there forever. I also could not help but observe, if you are going to read Annie Dillard out loud, you best prepare ahead of time, because there are tons of commas in this passage and there's only one period at the very, very end. So I I can see Oween with a red pen now, comma splice, comma splice, comma splice.
Yep.
Um, so
But she
I
does that on purpose.
she does, and that's what I wanted to bring up about when she gets to the part about a piece of land eaten and replenished a billion summers, a piece of land worked on, lived on, grown over, plowed under, stitched again and again. You don't want a period interrupting you in any of this. These are ideas that are simply flowing one from the other. And the idea that earth is plowed under and stitched again and again with fingers or with leaves, you know, the very act of farming the land actually does rip apart and then sew together the soil every year. So she's simply setting the scene for where this is for this farm. And we get our first introduction here. I lived there once, and I have seen from behind the barn the long roadside pastures heaped with silence. And I don't know, I hope all of us have had the experience of being outside the city, you know, out where it's not as crowded. And it is, it can even seem, you know, visiting my grandfather was a farmer up in Illinois. And when I would visit there, there was this overwhelming feeling of silence, even though there were noises. But the noises were the rustling of the corn stalks in the wind. You know, the noises were accepted because they were just part of nature, but yet you felt this dome of silence around you, even though there were some sounds. It was a very interesting experience. And so I could see where she was writing about this. And in this passage, by the way, she is a resident on the farm, but she is not the farmer. She lives in the farmhouse, but the actual farming family lives in another building on the property. And she talks about this. She says, fortunately, I was unconscious of my loneliness then. So again, imagine yourself standing with nothing but open fields, pastures around you, and this silence heaped there. I was unconscious of my loneliness then, felt it only deeply, bewildered in the half bright way that a puppy feels pain. And I had to take a minute to just kind of enjoy that last half sentence, because I thought that was a brilliant way of writing that. The half bright way that a puppy feels pain. Puppies just love and smile and play, and you know, and when they get hurt by something, they don't quite understand it. You know, they don't.
You're bewildered.
Yes.
And surprised.
Yeah. So I completely understood that. But putting these two ideas together, if you look at the two that are on the screen now, I have something I want you to think about. Now, I fully realize that none of you are in my math classes, because if you were, you would know that when I had my think boxes, that meant think for a second, but then say something.
I would say silence does not equal loneliness. But it doesn't have to.
Okay.
Personally, silence rarely equals loneliness. I like it. It's peaceful. I can sometimes hear myself think. Sometimes my mind actually will stop chattering.
In thinking about my own experiences, I think there are times when silence can exacerbate loneliness if my mindset is kind of dwelling on the loneliness already. You know, I might feel it more deeply in silence, but I don't think they're equal. I just thought it was interesting that those two passages were so close together in the telling of this story. So having set the setting of the farm and the, the pastures, the big pastures with heaps of silence on them, and setting up the idea that there were times that she felt lonely, but didn't really, she was bewildered by that feeling. So then we get into more of the crux of the story. And so she's walking about on the farm one day, and there are three passages that to me sort of went together that I thought were interesting. So in the first one, she describes the rooster, pulled his extravagant neck to its maximum length, hauled himself high on his legs, stretched his beak as if he were gagging, screamed and blinked. It was a ruckus. The din came from everywhere, and only the most rigorous application of reason could persuade me that it proceeded in its entirety from this lone and maniac bird. Just out of curiosity, does anyone in this group think that roosters sound like a little, flittering bell cock-a-doodle-doo?
Yeah.
If you've ever been on a farm, or if your neighbor in the city has a rooster, it sounds like cats are being slaughtered. It is loud and almost violent when a rooster crows. And so I thought that, as brilliant as that last part was about the most rigorous application of reason could persuade me, that just by putting that one word screamed in there, I thought that did disservice to what's actually happening when a rooster makes a noise. So we have this going on. So she's out, walking about on the farm, and here's her experience with the rooster. So that's the first part of this little part. Then we come to the next part of this little drama that we have going on here. It almost seemed to me that in the middle of an Annie Dillard essay, we had a little Euripides play. It was kind of interesting to me as I read this. So to the rooster, I said nothing, but only stared, and he stared at me. We were both careful to keep the wooden fence slat from our line of sight so that his profiled eye and my two eyes could meet. So we're talking about a stare down. I mean, we're not even letting something get in our way. We're making sure the fence, no, my eyes are above or below the slat, whatever it takes for me just to stare at this rooster.
They are wary of each other. And she was.
I think she's she's deeply troubled by the rooster's cacophony and its interruption of the peace of the silence of the farm.
And Oween, you froze there for a second. So what is it what does it upset her about the peace of the silence on the farm?
The cacophony of the rooster, and it has interrupted her connection with the silence and the peace of the farm and the land, and thus the stare down.
And I completely agree with that, because I made reference to a poem that none of you would have ever possibly been able to see, because it was in the literary magazine of my tiny little college out in Arkansas. But it was written by an English major who, in fact, he teaches English now at University of South Carolina, and he is the poet laureate for the state of South Carolina. And he wrote a poem about opening the windows and hearing the sounds of nature. And both the title and the opening line of the poem were "Shut up, bird."
So I think the landscape of this farm, there is a level of angst to it for Annie Dillard. And it reflects an angst that she carries with her. But it's an important connection that she is experiencing. And sort of like that poet, she wants to say to the rooster, "Shut up." And isn't it interesting that she also mentions the cicadas, which somewhere in our world right now, somebody's saying the same thing about the cicadas.
So the first part of this little mini story within a story is the rooster, Annie walking around the quiet farm, and then the rooster making this ruckus. And then the second part was this great stare down. this, the meeting of the eyes of these two.
So
And-
putting this side by side with the earlier short story, even
Mhm.
though the deer is not screaming, I'm sure that the guy who was burned was screaming.
Mm-hmm.
And again, both of those narratives interrupt the silence or the aloneness of our daily lives.
Okay.
So the staring, and here the staring is, what are you willing to look at?
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
So then little act 3, when I was turned away from the rooster in this manner, the silence gathered and struck me. It bashed me broadside from above like yard goods. 10 acres of fallen invisible sky choked the fields. And it does seem to me in a very short time, her relationship with the farm has actually changed. Her relationship with the space has changed. What caused the change?
Maybe just being in the environment. I've been on a big farm a
Mhm,
few times,
mhm,
and you walk the fields,
mhm,
and especially, this was in Kentucky,
mhm,
on a hot, humid day, it does feel like the sky has whoosh fallen to the ground,
mhm.
and you feel it. You feel the air. It's even hard to breathe, very silent, and yet, as you said,
Mhm.
little bird, bug, wind, little breeze. It's always felt holy to me.
Okay. And then there's this fairly long passage where we just go into a period of silence. Um, she describes in fairly great detail the surrounding area, what stopped, what was moving, the fields, the fencing, a parked orange truck, just various things, but a fairly long description of this silence takes place next. And then finally, at last I heard whistling, human whistling far in the air, and I was not able to bear it. I looked around, heartbroken. Only at the big yellow Chevrolet farm far up the road was there motion. A woman, I think, dressed in pink and pushing a wheelbarrow easily over the grass. It must have been she who was whistling and heaping on top of the silence those hollow notes of song. I did have to look up Chevrolet, and it's simply a type of French beef cattle. And so the farm next to theirs apparently was a beef farm, a cattle farm. She actually goes into a bit more description at this point about the notes of the whistling, the slow sound of the music, the beautiful sound of the music ringing in the air like a stone bell was isolate and detached. So she's has a silence heaped upon her, but then it's broken by this sound of human whistling, but it's kind of almost an eerie sound instead of a pleasing one.
And
then
she goes on to say when she sees the woman in her wheelbarrow that they were flat and detached.
Mhm.
So there's something about these interruptions in her view and the silence that are detaching for her. Again, I think it's a reflection of how her soul is connecting with this land.
Mhm. And that connection seems to be turning a little bit deeper now, because Barbara, you were talking about the feeling of being on the farm with whether it was the humidity, whatever the actual weight that was on you. And in this passage, in her mind now, the whole show vanished. The whistling became ordinary, familiar. The air above the fields released its pressure. I loved that passage. The air above the fields released its pressure. So now you don't have that weight bearing down on you anymore.
And she says, holiness is a force, and like the others, can be resisted.
Mm-hmm.
That really just came off the page.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So Annie herself whistles. And when that happens, she said she looked to the rooster, but the result of the whistling were some hens came to the chicken house window and fluttered down. And once again, we seem to be at the end of the story. And now we're going to go off in what's seemingly a completely different direction. So that direction, though, is she talks about how a few months later, she's walking by the field going to a volleyball match. Kind of an interesting detail there. And she just offhandedly says to a companion, the field is full of angels. And shocked herself because you get the feeling that she really didn't necessarily believe in angels. They were not a part of her conscious life. You know, this was not something she spent a great deal of time thinking about. And so it's kind of like, why did these words just fall out of my mouth? How did this happen? What do we have going on here? And so, as you said, Barbara, same phrase struck me about holiness being a force. And I thought that her quote where she decided what God was going to say, I don't know how much God had to do with that, but she decided what God was going to say. I am here, but not as you have known me, which is, I think, what we are told about angels. We might not know who around us are angels or how they affect us. This is the look of silence and of loneliness unendurable. It too has always been not mine and now will be yours. And I couldn't help but think that why did God create this world that we live in and create us, you know, men and women? And part of the reason is, I think he was a little bit lonely there. You know, he needed people to be mindful of him.
This brings to mind, if you haven't heard G. Alexander's sermon this morning, I happened to be at 8 o'clock. And, you know, one of the things that he will say is in a conversation that he had with a Jewish rabbi about telling stories, and why the rabbi liked Genesis so much was because he could tell stories about, you know, what is God looking at, like when he sees us. And G goes on to say that the rabbi, I believe it was the rabbi, said, well, you know, what you talk about is the kingdom of God is not, and you could perhaps equate holiness with that, but what the kingdom of God is not a place, or that it is a force. It's the foundational force of the universe. And he doesn't say a whole lot more about it, but he does make the connection that, you know, that's what it is. It's a force. So I don't know, that just kind of resonates to me with what Annie Dillard is talking about. And as the God says, I'm here, but not as you've known me. I mean, I think that's true so often. What we expect God to do and how God should be doesn't necessarily seem to be the way it actually happens. So, I don't know. Again,
I was thinking of the poet Rumi too, who says, don't worry that your life is turning upside down. How do you know that the side you're used to is better than the one that is to come? So I feel as if her life has been flipped.
Right.
There is a way in which the life that she was used to is now upside down.
And her description of her journey through that field, all the way up to the conversation with the friend as they walk to the volleyball game, it is flipped. And then she says, on the in the middle of the next to the last paragraph. My impression now of those fields is of thousands of spirits trapped perhaps by my refusal to call them more fully, or by the paralysis of my own spirit at the time. Sorry, Michael,
Yeah.
there it is. Go ahead.
No. I'm actually delighted that apparently we were all thinking along the same line. And that to me was kind of the emphasis of that little 3-act drama in the middle of this short story, that we have this silence and there's this element of loneliness perhaps attached to it. And then we have this cacophony of noise followed by a second silence with the stare down. So this is not a peaceful silence. This is a tense silence. This is a standoff. And then the turning away and looking at what's going on and seeing what's happening in the world, and finally hearing that whistle that made everything just kind of disappear, the tension. And then we turn to the story about where we think we now hear angels. So actually the story is we see angels. I just said hear angels because I'm hearing some now. Apparently we're rehearsing a song. The choir's rehearsing. So and then here at the very end, or actually there's one line after that, but there are angels in those fields, and I presume in all fields and everywhere else. I would go to the lions for this conviction to witness this fact. This is a pretty strong statement for a writer who about 10 lines before this said, why am I talking about angels? I've never thought about angels before, but now convinced of their existence and interaction with us. What all this means about perception, or language, or angels, or my own sanity, I have no idea. I will confess that I colored that last line. I thought that this was an amazing conclusion to a story. Do any of you have any ideas about what it means about language, angels, or your own sanity?
I think it's
She makes me think of herself as the rooster.
I
Mm.
think it's fun to have no
She
idea.
interrupted herself.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, there's this whole thing about the maniac and alien character that she assigns to the rooster.
Mhm.
This is kind of an unusual conclusion for her.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I hope that you may have had your own sanity, perhaps either affirmed or questioned this morning. Either way is fine. It makes you think. And I thank you very, very much for spending some time this morning looking at these two essays by Annie Dillard. I thoroughly enjoyed reading them, and I hope that you did as well.